Hello and welcome to Nostalgia Maker, Memory Box 2. It's a sequel. Since my first Memory Box video did so well, I thought I would create a second one. Actually, it's my lowest performing video so far. But as they say, sequels are always better than the original, right? Well, at least that's my hope for this one. Kind of like Paddington 2. Perhaps the only sequel that bested the original.
Paddington 2 is incredible. Told you.
So I'm going to start out by using my hand plane to flatten out some of the sides of these pieces of walnut. I don't need them to be as thick as they are, and the best way to rip these boards would be to pass them through a bandsaw, but since I don't have one, I'm going to use my table saw by passing two sides of the board through the saw at the same width. There's a lot of reasons I don't like this table saw method of splitting boards. The cuts usually don't line up perfectly, so I end up cutting them a 1/16 of an inch thicker, and then I have to clean them up later with my hand plane. So now I'm going to set my table saw blade at a 45-degree angle and cut each sides of the walls. Gonna check and make sure everything is looking good and lining up. And it is. Next thing I will do is cut the recesses on the bottom of the walls to house the bottom of the box. Before I glue up the walls, it's very important to sand the inside of the box. It's very difficult to sand everything appropriately on the inside of the box once it's all put together, corners and whatnot. The reason why I mark the surface of the wood in between each grit is to make sure I am sanding enough to get rid of the previous grit marks as I work my way up to higher and higher grits. Now it's time for the glue up. Using tape is by far my favorite way to glue the edges of boxes together. It makes it very easy to line things up without the walls of the boxes that you're not holding on to from falling over. Now, one thing I am not going to do is glue the bottom of the box to the box itself. It's essentially going to float within the recess that I cut. This will ensure that when the wood expands and contracts, it won't crack or warp the board on the bottom of the box. After removing the clamps, I'm going to use this small block plane to make sure that the edges of the top of the box are flush. And now I'm using the same block plane to add a chamfer to these pieces of curly maple for some decorative inner molding. Love those curls. Gonna cut the ends at a 45-degree angle and glue them in place. Not sure what happened to my camera while shooting this, but it kind of looks like I have a rave going on in my garage. Now to clamp in those bottom pieces, I'm going to wedge in some scrap wood for a makeshift clamp. After making an impromptu 45-degree jig and attaching it to my makeshift miter sled, I'm going to make a total of 8 cuts on the corners of the box and add some pieces of curly maple. Really more for aesthetics than anything else. I suppose it may add some strength to the seams, but really not sure. I love this little flush cut saw. It does a great job of making those flat cuts. Gonna do some rough grit sanding to the base for now and move on to working on the top of the box. First thing I'm going to do is cut out the border for the top, some more 45-degree angles. Sometimes cutting things on the table saw at 45 degrees is a little tricky. It's a little hard to gauge where the cut will end up at the top of the cut when you start at a side of an angle. So I tend to make these little starter cuts and work my way over when I know it's going to line up just right. Now I'm going to glue and clamp these edges onto the top so that the middle of the top sits proud on the inside of the box. So everything up to this point has been pretty much exactly what I did in my first memory box video. However, instead of carving a flower design in the top, I'm going to do an inlay of a flower design. I'm sure you can see that much like a sequel, I add the complexities that make a distinct departure from the original. Truth being told, an inlay is a much harder, more time-consuming thing to attempt. And it's actually my very first one. I'm really not a fan of practicing anything, and the same was true when I started this flower inlay, but I watched a few YouTube videos and hope for the best. It was very easy using this template, just time consuming. After cutting out each of the pieces and gluing them on the thin pieces of curly maple, I used a chisel and some makeshift sandpaper files to shape the wood to the edges of the paper. I was pleasantly surprised how well this was all working. It was only the last petal that I had to make some serious adjustments to make a perfect fit. Now this is probably the most helpful thing that I learned while watching some inlay tutorials. When gluing pieces together, it makes it very easy if you use the sticky side of tape to essentially hold and lock the pieces into place. The glue that I'm using is some Gorilla Super Glue Gel. Gonna add some wood glue to seep into the margins and let it dry under a weight. Wax paper is a very effective tool anytime that you want to prevent glue from bonding to unwanted surfaces. Now I'm going to use some double-sided tape to hold the flower down on the top of the board while I use an X-Acto knife to scroll the outline of the flower. Looks pretty good. Just going to make some deeper cuts to ensure that I'm going to be able to make a nice tight fit. The chisels and the carving tools were pretty effective in removing the edges of the inlay, but I wish I had just used the router with this 1/8 size bit to do the whole thing. I was really surprised at how much control I had with the compact router, especially on a lower speed setting. If I had used the router the whole time, I don't think I would have had nearly as many gaps as I ended up having. After gluing and clamping the flower, I just had to use a couple of sanders to remove the paper stencil. All there is at this point is some fit and finish and a lot of sanding. I brought everything to 400 grit and used some glue to fill in some of those small gaps in the inlay. Putting glue in the creases and sanding it while it is slightly wet is a great way of hiding some small mistakes. Before I add the finish, I'm going to carve out the areas where the hinges are going to sit. Now it's time for the finish. I really love this oil-based polyurethane spray from Ace Hardware. I use it on most of my smaller woodworking projects. It sprays with a very light mist that makes for a very smooth finish in the end. There goes the hinges. Figured I'd go with bronze this time. And it's finished. This memory box, as well as the first one that I made, were actually gifts that my wife suggested that I make. In this case, we had a surprise birthday party for my big sister, and we put lots of nice notes and whatnot for her in the box. I'm not really making these memory box videos for the sake of a successful YouTube series, but it seems that these boxes may continue to be requested for others in the future, and so why not make a series where I try to improve my memory box making skills. I really love how the finish brought out the grain in both the walnut and curly maple. You can really see the iridescence of the wood pop when the light hits it just right. Apparently the correct term for that is an effect called chatoyance. The chatoyance turned out very chatoyant. Very nice. Overall, I think my first inlay turned out okay. My sister was happy with it, so I like it.